Going to the doctor is not like going shopping. It's important to be clear that there's no such thing as a legal right to euthanasia, let alone a right to access it in a particular place, let alone a right to force somebody to be involved in it in a way that they don't want to, that conflicts with their sense of identity and purpose. It's fundamentally changing the deal. It's not what Kiwis voted for. It would move health practitioners much closer to involvement with euthanasia than they have to be now. MPs will get a conscience vote on it, and yet the proposal is not to allow health practitioners or care facilities to use their conscience in the way they can now. Ultimately, I think what you're looking at is undermining the foundation of medicine.
Welcome to the Maxim Institute podcast. I'm Maryanne Spurdle, the research manager here. Now, the New Zealand Bill of Rights draws lines that shouldn't be crossed to preserve our fundamental rights, like our right to life and speech and conscience. But sometimes one person's human right is another's threat to rights. Today we have the director of Ethos Alliance, Alex Penk, joining us. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Maryanne. Good to be here.
And those of you who've been following Maxim for maybe 5 years or more will remember Alex as the CEO here.
Yeah, a little more than 5 years ago, I think.
How long ago?
Oh gosh, it was just over 6 years ago that I walked out that front door for the last time as the CEO. Been back since. Good to be back today.
Yeah, and so many people will remember you. For those who haven't caught up with what you're doing now, you're also a lawyer. You founded Ethos Alliance in your time since you've been here. To address just the kind of issues that we're talking about today. So for those who haven't been following Ethos yet, could you just give us a summary of what you do there?
Yeah, thank you. So at Ethos, we use law to help people who are facing some kind of challenge to living out their most important beliefs. In the context of what we're going to talk about today, that might look like health practitioners of various kinds who are being asked to do something that they feel like crosses a line, that puts them in a position where they say, look, in good conscience, I just can't go along with what you're asking me to do. That would fundamentally contradict who I am, the reason I got into medicine. I wouldn't be able to look at myself in the mirror in quite the same way. We think it's really important to be able to help people kind of protect that sense of who they are, so they can live out their most important beliefs and put them into practice. So our work is basically focused on promoting and protecting the ability to do that, either by offering direct support. One small contradiction, this is kind of a pedantic lawyerish thing to say, but you'll understand why I say it in a minute. I'm not a lawyer now. I used to be a lawyer, but we work with lawyers.
Yeah.
So there's like a network of people who help us in that work.
Cool. As you know, Maxim's been weighing into the euthanasia debate over the years. To catch everyone up, could you just roughly explain what is legal now with the Euthanasia, the End-of-Life Choice Act, and with Act's amendment bill that's waiting in the tin? What changes would it make that would be significant?
Yeah. So, obviously the sort of the headline that I think most people will be familiar with is at the moment, euthanasia and assisted suicide are legal if you have a terminal illness which is expected to end your life within the next 6 months. One of the really key changes that ACT are proposing is to expand eligibility, basically using words that would cover just a whole range of long-term chronic conditions and disabilities. So think of things like renal failure, diabetes, frailty, as well as conditions like motor neuron disease, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, that kind of thing. So it's a really significant change to the law that we have now, which you might remember is a law that New Zealand has actually voted for in a referendum. So it's kind of, it's fundamentally changing the deal. It's not what Kiwis voted for. That's probably the first thing to understand about what's being proposed. The second thing, and the issue that we've really concentrated on, is what changes could be made to health practitioners' conscience rights in the bill. And I'll try and do this without getting too technical, basically. If we start with the issue of what are called care facilities, so these are places like a hospice or a rest home, public hospital, disability support services. At the moment, there's no obligation on them to assist with or take part in assisted dying. In fact, there is a really significant High Court decision which basically said conscience is a cornerstone of the law, and no institution is compelled to offer assisted dying as part of their services if that goes against their reason for being.
So this High Court decision specifically spoke about offering assisted dying.
Exactly. Yeah, and specifically about the position of institutions. It was actually brought by Hospice NZ, which is the umbrella organisation for the hospices around the country. One of the changes that the bill, Todd Stevenson's bill, one of the changes that would make is basically to say that the care facilities, and this is defined really broadly, so places that offer personal care services, health services, things like assistance with showering, medication, getting dressed, hygiene, even substantial emotional support. Places which offer those kind of services would have to allow at least some cases of assisted dying to take place in their premises. Now, that would be the case even if that goes against the whole reason those places were established. So if you think of somewhere like hospice, they're set up to neither hasten nor postpone natural death. And if you listen to hospice staff, they'll say things like, what we do is we help people live well. So I think it would put organisations like that in a really untenable position. It kind of backs them into a corner. And you imagine, that you work somewhere like that, or that you're part of a movement which is set up to support people who are in a vulnerable condition at the end of their lives. What I think there's a really sort of big question mark over, what are organisations like that going to do if you back them into a corner? They're already stretched, they're already under pressure. And even if you just take aside those pragmatic questions, there's this big question around, is this even the right thing to do? To put people in a position where they might have to violate their whole kind of, in the case of an organisation, their whole reason for existence.
Yeah. And I know there are questions, so maybe you could speak to the individual conscience rights that are being narrowed by this bill, and then we can kind of talk about what the difference between an institution and a person legally.
Yeah. So the second major change that the bill would make is exactly as you said. It would change the law for individual health practitioners. So at the moment, what the law says is if you're a health practitioner, you don't have to assist with euthanasia or assisted suicide in any way, unless you are what the law calls the attending medical practitioner. And that basically just means...
And you opt in to be the attending medical practitioner, right?
Yeah, well, you might be that person regardless, just because it basically means the doctor who's caring for the patient.
Okay.
So if you are that doctor and a patient asks you, says, I want to look into assisted dying, and that's not something that squares with your conscience, you can say to the patient, look, I can't help you with that. I have a conscientious objection, but you can contact what's called the SCENS group. That stands for Support and Consultation for End of Life New Zealand, which just trips off the tongue. But you can contact that group and get the details of a replacement doctor who will do euthanasia. That's at the moment, that's the only obligation on health practitioners. The bill, which could end up before Parliament, would basically say that all health practitioners have an obligation to give those contact details or to contact the assisted dying service for the patient. And rather than saying, you don't have to be involved at all, it would narrow down by saying, you can be excused from specific activities, which are basically things that are most closely connected to carrying out euthanasia, like actually administering the lethal medication. But a health practitioner could still find themselves, for example, having to give patient information to a doctor who's going to perform the euthanasia. They could find themselves part of a team caring for that caring for that patient. So health practitioners are going to be sort of, if this bill becomes law, which is a question that we should talk about, but it would move health practitioners much closer to involvement with euthanasia than they have to be now. And there's a really important question about what message does that send about, doctors having kind of the freedom to think about these issues for themselves versus having to kind of take direction from the state about, what they have to do where they might have to compromise if they have to be involved in providing these services.
The conversation from the Ministry of Health side and in the review that came out at the end of 2014 seems to revolve around a patient's right to access services, a consumer rights model. And any discussion about doctors' rights automatically puts them secondary to the patient's. Now, first of all, does the patient have a right to medical care? Because, I mean, what type of medical care and how soon? Like, all of those things are open questions. And in the case of euthanasia, I mean, if the end is death, it's not like you can prevent someone from dying, because we are all going to die.
Yeah.
So there are questions about what kind of right they're talking about for the patient to access. And then, is it correct, even if there is that right, for them to say that the doctor's rights are secondary to access rights?
Yeah, I mean, these are really important questions. Maybe sort of two thoughts to start with. One is that, going to the doctor is not like going shopping. None of us has a right to just sort of turn up to the doctor and say, look, I'd like a kidney transplant. We expect doctors to exercise clinical judgment. We expect them to in some ways to actually help us kind of navigate a process and navigate options. And I think it's just, it's important to be clear that there's no such thing as a legal right to euthanasia. Let alone a right to access it in a particular place, like a care facility, let alone a right to force somebody to be involved in it in a way that they don't want to, that conflicts with their sense of identity and purpose. So I think it's a really fundamental mistake, to be honest. I don't think there's any other way to put it. It's a fundamental error to kind of say that there's this right that has to trump doctors' or health practitioners' conscience positions. Nevertheless, as you say, that's exactly what we see from the ministry. And this is the second thing. They've been really explicit in saying that the balance of rights should favour patients, although they call them health consumers, and I think that language is important and revealing.
Yes.
Back to the shopping analogy, are we consumers or are we patients who rely on experienced professionals? But they say where there's a conflict, basically you've got to prefer what the patient says they want.
Yeah.
And that's a really significant value judgment in itself, and that's something that I think we should interrogate.
Yeah, because from my understanding, patient-centered care isn't in response to what the patient most wants, but in other words, just prioritizing the good of a patient. So, and the language seems to be interpreted in a different way than it's...
And I think it's also really important to say, not in a kind of a paternalistic way. I think it's incredibly important that health practitioners are kind of listening to patients, hearing about their concerns, understanding their needs, and responding to those. And as you said before, the mortality rate's 100%. We're all going to die one day, but that doesn't mean that death isn't scary to contemplate, particularly if there's suffering at the end of life. Those are all genuine, real concerns. And I think we have to acknowledge that, and we have to meet people where they're at, where we may be one day ourselves. But I think there's a really big question around, is the best way to meet those concerns and to engage with people at that point by saying to health practitioners, no, you have to kind of squash down your beliefs and just give patients access to what is essentially a lethal injection?
Yeah.
Or are there better ways that we could kind of respond to patients' needs and concerns? I think you can tell from the way I'm phrasing that I think there are better ways.
Yeah. And what we're talking about is not denying somebody access to euthanasia. It's saying this not from this person, or in the case of institutions, not at this location, which is the case with most healthcare. We can't access everything everywhere. So do institutions have conscience rights?
Yeah, so good question. Maybe the non-legalistic answer is sort of. So the High Court in that hospice case that I talked about before basically said institutions pretty much have conscience rights to the maximum extent that it makes sense for them to do so. So an organisation doesn't have a conscience per se. However, there's a provision in our Bill of Rights Act, which is where you find the fundamental human right to freedom of conscience and freedom to manifest belief. And that law says basically that organisations should get the benefit of those rights to the maximum extent possible. So the High Court looked at something like hospice, which is set up with a specific ethos to do a specific job, and said, it makes sense that, you look at somewhere like hospice and say, yeah, they effectively have something very similar to a conscience. What that means is they shouldn't be required to do something that goes against their founding ethos, unless the law says that really clearly and specifically. And as we've already touched on, the court actually relied on the fact that the architect of the current law, David Seymour, had been very explicit in saying to Parliament, conscience is a cornerstone of this law. No institution will be required to do anything that they object to. So that's the deal that was made. That's what voters approved. Yeah. And so now we're looking at a proposal to kind of shift that goalpost. Yeah,
completely. And one of the side effects of having all institutions mandated to allow it on site for certain patients, and just because they won't have to for all, it still means they will at some point for some. Mm-hmm. That means that people who work in that field will not have the option of working somewhere where patients aren't being euthanized. Yeah. And it also means that patients don't have the option to being admitted to some place where people aren't being euthanized.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, I think the concept of sort of having no euthanasia-free spaces is an underappreciated kind of element of this. And if you are a patient who might have concerns about being in that kind of environment, literally you'll have that choice taken away from you. Yeah. And that's one of the big ironies about what's proposed here. This idea that the law is called the End of Life Choice Act, but these changes would fundamentally reduce the choices that are available to health practitioners and to doctors. And there's
patients.
It's kind of ironic that if this law ends up in front of Parliament, MPs will get a conscience vote on it, and yet the proposal is not to allow health practitioners or care facilities to use their conscience in the way they can now.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And this is anecdotal, but I know from someone who works in palliative care, they have seen patients opt not to be admitted to the one hospice that does allow euthanasia on site. Mm-hmm. Like they've made the conscious choice to go to a different hospice for that reason. Yeah. And also know that people who were working in that hospice left for that specific reason because they don't want to be working in that space. So it's not hypothetical. Like we know that there are people who are making decisions to go to different places because they have that choice now. Mm-hmm. And this bill, if it's passed in that way, would remove it. In Canada, and we won't get into the details, it's still before the courts, but there have been at least 2 hospices in Canada where the law doesn't say that all facilities have to allow it on site the way that this amendment would, but it's being debated. One hospice has been taken over, and this particular one is not a religious institution. So the one before the courts is, and one of the arguments is that this patient who had to be moved off site to receive euthanasia, her religious rights were violated because the religious beliefs of the institution changed her treatment. It was not what she preferred. And so they're taking a court case. One of the organizations giving testimony to support them actually had its hospice, which was built with philanthropists and donors. So private funding built it. And they've had it taken off of them because they won't allow euthanasia on site. So it kind of gives us a picture of if we open the door to that, hospices, like you said, will be backed into a corner if they're not happy offering it. That's all quite hypothetical, what's going to happen in the courts there. But precedence there will affect the way that things are judged here. What do you think the impact would be on healthcare at large if we get to that point where facilities don't have the option, patients don't have the option?
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing that we could see is just ethically minded people being forced out of medicine, because if you can't sort of find yourself in a place where you're not going to be presented with this dilemma, if you've got less there's a step that's being proposed now, and this is a shift from what was proposed originally. So I think there's a very reasonable question to ask, well, what would the next step be? And the picture that you can kind of see from, the kind of scenario you're describing in Canada is a scenario where you've gradually got governments kind of taking more control over what institutions and individual practitioners can do. So you'd sort of, I think, be very reasonable to worry about where that trajectory is going. And ultimately, I think what you're looking at is undermining the foundation of medicine, which sounds like a big thing to say, but when you think about what medicine involves, and this goes back to our conversation about, why healthcare is not like going shopping, you're actually asking a skilled professional to exercise judgment about complex situations where they're trying to reconcile like multiple goods all the time. So everything from like what's best for the patient in front of me, what are their needs, what are their concerns, how do I meet that, what are my own beliefs and concerns, how do I engage with a system that's actually in New Zealand under a lot of pressure. You've kind of always got healthcare rationing because no health system can meet every single need. But you're basically asking health practitioners to engage in this process of continual judgment making. But at the same time, we're contemplating laws that would kind of say, but don't use your judgment over here. So you're starting to create a situation where actually you say your personal judgment, your experienced clinical professional judgment isn't relevant over here. And when you do that, you start to send a message that it's not kind of central to the practice of medicine. And so we start to turn doctors and institutions more into deliverers of what the state has determined to be legal, accessible, whatever it is, rather than using their own kind of judgment. So I think that's a trajectory that you can see, coming out of the bill that's proposed here, potentially coming out of cases like the one that you're describing in Canada. Regardless of what you think about euthanasia, that actually has really significant consequences for medicine as a whole, and I think potentially puts practitioners in a really unsustainable position. And when you think about the fact that Act's bill would significantly expand the type of condition that's eligible for euthanasia, you can imagine now that there might be doctors who would say, I can accept the law the way it is. I'm okay with euthanasia in the case of, end-stage cancer, for example, which currently is, the majority of the conditions that qualify. But then you start expanding it out to the kind of conditions we were talking about before, chronic long-term conditions, disabilities, and so on. And you're putting doctors and institutions into a position where they will probably have a much greater number of conscience conflicts than they do right now, at the same time as you're squashing down the scope of conscience. That's not a sustainable position. Yeah.
And for the application in euthanasia particularly, even for doctors who don't have conscientious objection to providing it or to having other people provide it, because I think the majority of doctors actually do not want to participate in euthanasia. Is that, Even for those people who are kind of in the middle, when the Ministry of Health is emphasizing speed of access over safety, it puts pressure on doctors to shortcut the process as much as possible, lest they be seen as impeding someone's access to euthanasia. And thanks to an OIA that you guys put through at Ethos, we know that the shortest time from application to death is 2 days. And I think the most frequent time frame is 2 weeks. So the argument that there are impediments to people accessing it don't seem to be backed up by the stats, do they?
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly the numbers are going up. So, I mean, the Ministry of Health in their review that we've referred to previously, so this is a 3-yearly review that takes place, they basically said, we're expecting consistent year-on-year growth in the number of applications for euthanasia. So on the one hand, we've got this curve that just sort of goes up and to the right, which, actually sort of shows a pretty steady increase in growth. On the other hand, you've got this narrative that patients aren't able to access euthanasia who want it. And I'm not sure if those things square. the point about the data is an interesting one as well, because this is another deficiency in our law. Actually, the reporting and the data that's available is not very good.
Yeah.
And the whole reason we had to ask for that information from the Ministry of Health is that they were sort of reporting average figures about, time between application and death. And I looked at that and thought, well, what kind of average are we talking about here?
What's the range? Yeah.
Yeah. What's the range that we're talking about? And what's the median? And when you get those fuller numbers, which you actually see reported in overseas jurisdictions that we should be comparing ourselves to, when you get those numbers, you start to see like a bit of a different picture emerging from what's available from the very limited data that we have. So that's an area that I think genuinely needs some improvement.
Yeah.
But that's not really on the table.
No. Now, you have recently released a report on the Section 7, the analysis of the End-of-Life Choice Amendment Bill under the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act 1990. That came out last month. It's on your website at Ethos.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, so people can check that out. And thanks so much for being here with us today and chatting this through.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Maryanne.
Cheers.